The cold was a living thing, and it lived in the cellar with her. It wasn't just the damp seeping from the stone walls or the chill that crept up from the packed earth floor. No, it was a deeper cold, a cold that lived in her bones, a constant companion that reminded her what she was. Nothing. Less than nothing. Still, she worked. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, pushed the bone needle through the rough burlap of the rags she would wear to the feast. A feast? The word was a bitter joke. For her, it was not a celebration, but a stage for her humiliation. Every stitch was a prayer, a desperate, silent plea to be invisible, to not be seen, to not exist. Her stomach growled, a hollow ache that twisted deep inside her, so she closed her eyes and tried to remember the taste of the stolen crust of bread she'd had that morning. It was stale. It was hard. And it was the most delicious thing she had ever eaten. To make things worse, the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs groaned open, spilling a rectangle of hateful golden light onto the floor. Her breath caught. Footsteps, sharp, imperious. The sound of her stepmother, Lady Morwen. Nyssa froze, her body tensing because she knew what was coming. The inspection. The final reminder of her place before the performance began. Lady Morwen descended the stairs, her silk gown whispering threats against the stone. She moved with the grace of a hunting viper, her eyes missing nothing. She didn't just look at Nyssa. She assessed her, like a farmer inspecting livestock before the slaughter. A flicker of disgust crossed her perfectly painted lips. Pathetic, she murmured, the word echoing in the small space. Even for you. Nyssa kept her eyes fixed on the floor. To look up was to invite a strike. To speak was to beg for punishment. Silence was her only shield. Lady Morwen circled her slowly, the scent of her expensive perfume, lilac and poison, filling the cellar. Tonight is important. The king is restless. The court is a tinderbox, and every great family is looking for a match to light a fire of ambition. She stopped directly in front of Nyssa, and a manicured hand reached out, gripping Nyssa's chin with cruel strength, forcing her head up. You will not ruin this for my daughters. You will stand in your corner. You will not speak. You will not draw a single glance. Deep down, she knew the truth. Her stepmother didn't just want her to be invisible. She wanted her to be erased. Do you understand what is at stake? Morwen's voice was a low hiss, her eyes burning with a strange, feverish light Nyssa had never seen before. It wasn't just about marrying off her daughters. There was something else, something sharper. A secret that made the air in the cellar feel thin and dangerous. What could possibly be at stake that involved her? Nyssa gave a tiny, jerky nod. Good. The hand released her, and Morwen stepped back, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her gown. She kicked the mended rags at Nyssa's feet. Wear this, and pray that no one of any importance notices the filth clinging to our family name. Before she could move, her stepmother was already ascending the stairs, a specter of silk and malice. The door slammed shut, plunging the cellar back into its familiar gloom, and the bolt slid home with a sound of absolute finality. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Nyssa picked up the rags, her hands trembling. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. In the quiet that followed, she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the stone floor, that tonight would be different. Tonight, something was going to break. She didn't know what scared her more. The thought that it might be her, or the tiny, treacherous part of her that hoped it would be.
Meanwhile, in the heart of the keep, King Aldrich felt a different kind of cold. It was the cold of isolation, a frost that no roaring fire in the massive hearth could touch. He sat on the throne carved from the bones of a mountain cat, a symbol of his absolute power, and listened to the endless drone of a minor lord's petition. The words washed over him. He was surrounded by his court, his guards, his pack. Yet he was utterly, profoundly alone. His beta, Ronan, stood at his side, a steadfast presence of loyalty and concern. When the petitioner finally bowed and retreated, Ronan leaned in, his voice low. "The lords are growing restless, my king. They whisper, 'Another feast, another season, and still no Luna Queen by your side.'" Aldrich's jaw tightened. "Let them whisper." "It is more than whispers," Ronan pressed, his tone careful. "It is a weakness. They see a king without a mate, without an heir, and they see an opportunity." The word, mate, landed like a punch to the gut. It echoed in the vast throne room, a ghost of a word that held all the pain in the world. Despite that, he kept his face a mask of stone, because he had to be stone. Any crack in his armor would be exploited by the wolves circling his throne. He could feel it, the memory, sharp and jagged, threatening to surface. A different she-wolf, a different time. A bond that felt like destiny. A bond that had been a lie. A betrayal so deep it had nearly cost him his life and his crown. Camilla. Her name was a curse on his tongue. "I am the Alpha," Aldrich said, his voice a low growl that made the torches flicker. "My strength is not determined by who warms my bed. Remind them of that, Ronan, in any way you see fit." "Of course, Alpha." Ronan bowed his head, but Aldrich saw the worry etched on his friend's face. More importantly, Aldrich knew Ronan was right. A pack needed a Luna. It was their nature, their law. A king without a queen was a sky without a moon, vast, dark, and incomplete. But the scar on his soul was too deep. He would never trust the bond again. He would never allow himself that vulnerability. Never. "Prepare the hall," he commanded, rising from the throne. His voice was cold iron. "The performance is about to begin." He strode from the throne room, his black cloak swirling around him like a storm cloud. He could feel the eyes of the court on his back, some fearful, some ambitious, all of them hungry. They saw a king, a warrior, an alpha whose power was absolute. They didn't see the man inside, the man haunted by a ghost, the man whose own wolf paced the cage of his heart, snarling at the memory of a bond that had been a blade to the throat. He was going to this feast not as a king looking for a queen, but as a warden walking the rows of his prison, and he hated every single moment of it.
Moments later, that same dread felt like a physical weight pressing down on Nysa as she was led into the great hall. A guard had unbolted the cellar door and shoved her toward the noise and the light, his expression one of pure disgust. And now, she was here, in her corner. The hall was a beautiful, terrible nightmare. Banners depicting the great wolf packs hung from the rafters, their silken threads seeming to mock the burlap scratching at her skin. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, spiced wine, and the cloying perfumes of the court ladies. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so sharp it was a physical pain. With every heartbeat, the noise grew. Laughter, music, the clinking of goblets. To Nysa, it all sounded like the buzzing of carnivorous insects. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on a crack in the flagstones, because to look up was to meet their stares. The stares of pity, the stares of contempt, the stares of amusement. Each one was a tiny cut, and she was bleeding out from 1,000 of them. She could feel her stepsisters, Briar and Lyra, across the hall. She didn't have to see them to know they were preening, their new gowns shimmering, their laughter the loudest in the room. They were the jewels of the family. And she? She was the dirt they were wiped on. Truth be told, a part of her, a tiny, buried part, felt a spark of fury. Why? Why was this her life? What had she done to deserve this? But the fury was smothered as quickly as it came, buried under years of ingrained fear. To be angry was dangerous. To be nothing was safe. So she made herself nothing. She slowed her breathing. She became a statue of rags, a shadow in the corner. But then, the trumpets blared. A hush fell over the hall, sudden and absolute. The great oak doors at the far end swung open, and the king entered. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop herself. Her head lifted, just a fraction. As if pulled by a string, her gaze was drawn across the sea of silks and velvets to the figure who commanded the attention of the entire world. King Aldrich. He was a storm. a force of nature clad in black and silver, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his kingdom. His face was hard angles and shadow, his expression a mask of cold authority. He moved with a predator's grace, his presence so powerful it seemed to suck the very air from the room. And his eyes, as if fate demanded it, his gaze swept the hall, dismissing the fawning lords and simpering ladies. It moved past her sisters, past the high table, past everything, and then it stopped. On her. The moment their eyes locked, the world disappeared. The noise, the music, the laughter, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only the king. There was only the impossible, terrifying weight of his stare. It wasn't a look of pity or disgust. It was something else. Something fierce. Something hungry. Something inside her shifted. A strange heat bloomed deep in her belly, a warmth she had never felt before. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Her bones remembered him, even though she had never seen him before. Her soul answered a question she hadn't known it was asking. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted.
It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a choice. In the span of a breath, the king in his mind, the cold, calculating ruler scarred by betrayal, was thrown from his throne. Something else took its place, something older, wilder. A beast of instinct and moonlight that had slumbered in his soul for years, held down by chains of grief and mistrust. The wolf. And his wolf saw its moon. Her scent hit him across the cavernous hall, a scent of wood smoke and winter moonlight, of crushed herbs and something impossibly strong. It cut through the cloying perfumes and the smell of roasting meat and filled his lungs, his head, his entire being. The air thickened. The noise of the feast faded into a distant buzzing roar, and his world narrowed to a single point of light in the shadows. Her, the girl in rags, the forgotten one. His mind screamed, "No, not again. It's a trick, a weakness." He fought it, because to give in was to walk into the same fire that had burned him to ash before. He had built walls of ice around his heart for a reason. But then, his wolf rose up, and it shattered those walls with a single, silent howl that echoed in his bones. Mate. The word was not a whisper. It was a physical blow, a brand of fire on his soul. He felt the bond snap into place, a golden chain stretching from his chest to hers, pulling him, commanding him. There was no resisting it. An alpha does not resist his destiny. Without thinking, he was moving. The court parted before him like water before a ship's prow. He saw their shocked faces, their wide eyes, their open mouths. But they were blurry, insignificant. He heard the gasps, the sudden halt of the music, but it was all just background noise. His every sense, every fiber of his being, was focused on her. With every step he took, her scent grew stronger, pulling him in. He saw the terror in her wide silver eyes, the way her small body trembled. She looked like a cornered fawn, ready to bolt. And his wolf wanted to soothe her, to protect her, to wrap himself around her and snarl at the entire world. He finally reached her, standing before her in the corner she had tried so hard to disappear into. Time stood still. In that moment, he saw it all, the hidden strength beneath her fear, the quiet fire banked behind her eyes. She was not weak. She had just been waiting for a reason to burn. His hand moved on its own. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the back of her small, calloused hand. The moment their skin touched, a jolt. A shock of pure energy, hot and wild, arced between them. Her breath caught. His heart slammed against his ribs. In the echo of his own thundering pulse, his voice, low and rough with a possessiveness that stunned even him, spoke the single word that sealed their fate. Mine.
Her body moved on instinct, to flee. The king was coming. Not just walking, but striding across the hall, his golden eyes fixed on her with a predatory intensity that stole the air from her lungs. The entire world was watching. Every lord, every lady, her stepmother, her sisters. They were all frozen, their attention a physical weight that threatened to crush her. Her thoughts spun into a frantic, chaotic storm. He knows. He knows I am nothing. He is coming to punish me for daring to exist in his sight. He is coming to have me thrown out. Or worse. She didn't know what scared her more, his approach, or the strange, electric hum that had started under her skin the second their eyes had met. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. He stopped before her. So close. He smelled of pine and cold night air and something that was just him. Power. Dominance. Her instincts surged, screaming at her to bow her head, to show her throat, to make herself small. But then he reached for her. Before she could move, before she could even flinch, his fingers brushed against hers. Fire. A bolt of pure, liquid fire bloomed beneath her skin, racing up her arm and straight to her heart, which hammered a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. Her breath caught. The world tilted on its axis, and the only thing keeping her upright was the impossible heat of his touch. And his voice. A low, rumbling growl that vibrated through her very bones. Mine. The word wasn't a request. It was a statement, a fact, a claiming. And in that single heartbeat, Nisa's world didn't just shift. It shattered into a million glittering, terrifying pieces. Without another word, his hand closed around hers, strong and possessive. He began to pull her from the corner, out into the center of the hall. She stumbled after him, her mind a complete blank. This couldn't be happening. Kings didn't claim girls in rags. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a death sentence. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The faces of the court were a blur of shock and outrage, but one face was perfectly clear. Lady Morwen. Her stepmother's expression was not just angry. It was murderous, a cold, reptilian fury that promised a pain worse than any beating. Briar and Lyra stood beside her, their mouths hanging open in slack-jawed disbelief that quickly curdled into pure venomous jealousy. She had to get away, because this man, this king, was not a savior. He was a beautiful, terrible storm that would tear her world apart. Please, she whispered, the word so soft it was stolen by the shocked silence. No. He didn't seem to hear her. His grip was like iron as he led her away from the great hall, down a long, torchlit corridor lined with the portraits of his ancestors. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her, judging her, condemning her. He finally stopped before a set of massive, carved wooden doors and pushed them open. He pulled her inside, and the doors clicked shut behind them, the sound echoing like a key turning in a lock. The room was vast and overwhelming, a king's private chambers. A fire roared in a hearth big enough to stand in. Furs were draped over massive chairs. The air smelled of old books and power. It was the most beautiful cage she had ever seen.
The moment the doors to his chambers clicked shut, the fragile control Aldrich had regained shattered. His wolf was pacing, snarling, high on the claiming. It wanted to scent her, to pull her close, to cover her with his own smell and hide her from the world. But the man, the king, was reeling. What had he done? He had just declared war on his own court, for a girl he didn't even know. She stood in the center of the room, trembling, looking so small and out of place amidst the grandeur. Her eyes were wide with terror, not adoration. She looked at him not as a mate, but as a captor, and maybe she was right. Before he could speak, the doors burst open again, not with a polite knock, but with the force of outrage. Lord Valerius, the oldest and most powerful member of his council, stood there, his face purple with rage. Behind him were 3 other lords, their expressions equally furious. "Alpha!" Valerius boomed, his voice shaking with disbelief. "What is the meaning of this? You cannot be serious." Aldrich moved instantly, placing himself between them and Nissa. A low growl rose in his throat, a warning that was pure instinct. "You forget yourself, Valerius. You do not burst into your king's chambers." "I forget nothing," the old wolf snarled. "You bring this outcast, this nothing into the heart of our world and claim her as your own. It is an insult. a disgrace to the crown and to every pack that serves it. She is my mate, Aldrich bit out, the words tasting strange and foreign on his tongue. Yet, as he said them, he felt the truth of them settle in his soul. The bond has chosen. It is done. The bond can be wrong, another lord shouted. You, of all people, should know that. The words were a poisoned dart, aimed directly at the old wound of his past. Camilla. The betrayal. The shame. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He would not let them dictate his choice because their counsel had failed him once before, with disastrous consequences. They had all praised Camilla. They had all celebrated that bond. Look where it had led. Get out, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. We will not. Valerius took a step forward. We demand you renounce her. Set her aside. For the good of the kingdom, Aldrich, before this madness destroys everything your father built. That was it. The final straw. The rage, the possessiveness of his wolf, and the defiance of the king all merged into a single, unstoppable force. His eyes began to glow, the faint golden light of the wolf within breaking through. There is nothing to renounce. Each word was a chip of ice. He took a step toward them, and the powerful lords, warriors all, instinctively took a step back. She is my mate. Another step. She is your future queen. He stopped, his voice dropping to a low growl that promised violence. Challenge this, and you challenge me. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, filled with unspoken threats. Valerius stared at him, his chest heaving, but the challenge in his eyes died, replaced by a cold, simmering hatred. He gave a stiff, formal bow. As you command, my king. The words were correct, but the tone was an oath of rebellion. He turned and swept from the room, the other lords following in his wake. The doors clicked shut again, leaving Aldrich alone with the terrified girl and the war he had just declared.
The echo of the great doors slamming shut was a physical blow. In the quiet that followed, Nissa was acutely aware of the man standing just a few feet away. The king. Her mate. The word was a foreign country she had no map for. He turned to face her, and his golden eyes were no longer burning with the feral light of the wolf, but with something more complicated. Conflict, confusion. Her world tilted. He was the most powerful man in the kingdom, and he looked at her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. The servants will bring you whatever you need, he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. Food, a bath, gowns. He was trying to be kind, she realized, but his kindness felt like another set of chains. He saw a frightened girl who needed protecting. He didn't see the survivor who had lived her entire life on a knife's edge. So, when a servant girl entered with a whispered apology and a tray of food rich enough to feed a family for a week, Nissa just stared at it. Moments later, another 2 servants arrived, carrying a dress of midnight blue silk so fine it seemed to float on the air. They laid it on the bed, a shimmering pool of impossible luxury. She didn't move. She couldn't. Because she knew what this was. That night, after a bath in water scented with oils she couldn't name and dressed in silks that felt alien against her skin, Aldrich returned. He found her standing by the massive window looking out at the moonlit courtyard below. You are safe here, he said, his voice softer than before. Her breath caught. Safe. It was the one thing she had craved her entire life. But this wasn't it. She turned to face him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Am I? She whispered, her voice trembling. Or am I simply your prisoner now? His brow furrowed. That's absurd. You are my mate. I am protecting you. Protecting me or hiding me? The words tumbled out before she could stop them, fueled by a lifetime of being silenced. You claimed me in front of your entire court and then locked me in these rooms. You fight your lords over me like I am a piece of property, a prize you won. Have you even asked me what I want? Deep down, she knew the truth. She had to fight this, because trading one cellar for a gilded cage was not freedom. It was just a prettier prison. Aldrich stared at her, his jaw tight. "What I want," he said, his voice dangerously low, "is to keep you alive. The court is full of vipers. You have no idea of the danger you are in." "I have lived with vipers my entire life," she shot back, surprising herself with her own fire. "I know danger. What I don't know is this. I don't know you, and I will not be kept in a cage, no matter how beautiful it is." The tension broke between them, cracking like lightning. He took a step closer, his scent filling the air, and for the first time, she didn't shrink back. She stood her ground. His golden eyes blazed, but beneath the anger, she saw something else. Something she hadn't expected. Surprise. He had expected a frightened mouse. Instead, he had found a wolf cub, small and trembling, but with the first sharp glint of fangs. And in his stunned silence, she felt a tiny, unfamiliar flicker of power.
Moments later, her words still ringing in his ears, Aldrich faced a different kind of fire. "I will not be kept in a cage." The girl, his mate, had more spirit than any she-wolf he had ever known, and it was going to get her killed. He left her in his chambers, her defiant glare burning into his back, and strode directly to the council room, his own anger a cold, controlled fury. The atmosphere inside was glacial. The lords who had confronted him were there, along with the rest of his inner circle. Lord Valerius sat at the head of the table, his expression smug, as if he had already won. Aldrich knew he had to crush this rebellion now. He had to be merciless because in the world of wolves, any perceived weakness is an invitation to be torn apart. "I trust you all enjoyed the feast," Aldrich began, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he remained standing at the head of the table, asserting his dominance. Valerius gave a thin smile. "It was eventful, my king. The packs will be talking. They will question the strength of a bloodline that chooses indiscriminately." The insult was clear, a direct challenge to his authority and his choice. "My bloodline is my own," Aldrich growled, leaning forward and placing his hands flat on the table. The heavy oak groaned under the pressure. "And my choice is absolute. Let us be clear on that." He stared down Valerius. A silent battle of wills waged across the polished wood. "But you raise an interesting point about strength. Some lands, I find, have grown too comfortable, too soft." He straightened up, his gaze sweeping the room. "Lord Valerius, your service on the Border Council has been long. As a reward, I am reassigning you. You will henceforth oversee the salt mines at the Northern Ridge, a post of great importance." The room went deathly silent. The salt mines were a place of exile, a political grave. Valerius's face turned from smug purple to ashen white. He had gambled, and he had lost spectacularly. "My king," he stammered. "You are dismissed." Aldrich cut him off, his voice like the crack of a whip. "All of you, leave me." The lords scrambled to obey, their arrogance replaced with fear. Soon after, only Ronan, his beta, and Kale, his quiet, deadly head of spies, remained. "That was a bold move," Ronan said, breaking the silence. "You've made an enemy for life." "He was already an enemy," Aldrich countered, rubbing his temples. "Now he is a neutered one." He looked at Kale, who had been silent throughout. "What have you found?" Kale stepped forward from the shadows. His voice was always a whisper, which made his words all the more terrifying. "The threat is not just whispers, my king. We intercepted a message. A poisoner was hired, a specialist in wolfsbane derivatives. The order came from within the keep." Aldrich's blood ran cold. This was not just political maneuvering. This was an assassination plot. "Who?" he demanded. "The trail is masked, but it leads back to the household of Lady Morwen. Her stepmother." "Of course." In that moment, Nisa's defiant words about vipers echoed in his mind. She had no idea. She thought he was a tyrant, when in fact he was the only thing standing between her and a painful death. This changed everything. His need to protect her wasn't just instinct anymore. It was a race against a hidden clock, and he would chain her to his side if it meant keeping her heart beating.
As the silence in the royal chambers stretched, it began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. Aldrich had not returned after their argument. Servants came and went with silent feet, offering her food she couldn't eat and comforts she didn't want. What she wanted was air. What she wanted was a choice. Just one. Without thinking, she found herself walking toward a small, arched doorway she had noticed earlier. It led to a balcony, and beyond that, a winding stone staircase descended into a private garden. It was foolish. It was reckless. And she let it happen. She had to breathe. The night air was cool and sweet, a blessed relief after the stifling tension of the chambers. The garden was beautiful, a maze of silver-leafed trees and night-blooming jasmine whose scent hung heavy and sweet in the air. For the first time since she'd been dragged from the cellar, Nisa felt a sliver of peace. Maybe it was fate that her sister found her, or maybe some vipers are just very good at sniffing out mice even when they're hiding in a lion's den. Well, well, look what the wolf dragged in. Nisa froze, her back to the voice. Briar, her eldest stepsister. She turned slowly. Briar stood there, a vision in emerald silk, a cruel, satisfied smile playing on her lips. I must admit, little sister, I'm impressed. A cellar rat one moment, the king's pet the next. You always were full of surprises. What do you want, Briar? Nisa asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Oh, nothing, Briar said, circling her like a shark. I'm just worried about you. This is a dangerous place. A king's favor can be a fleeting thing. And when he tires of his new toy... She let her words hang in the air. Things can get broken, lost, forgotten. The threat was as clear as the moon in the sky. I'm not your toy to break, Nisa said, the words tasting of a courage she didn't know she possessed. Briar's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. Aren't you? You always have been. Remember that little bird you found with the broken wing? You nursed it so carefully, and I believe Father needed new feathers for his arrows. She sighed dramatically. Such a shame. Nisa's blood ran cold at the memory. The small, broken body of the bird. Stay away from me, Nisa whispered. I'll do my best, Briar said with a laugh. But you should be careful who you trust, little sister. Not every strong arm that pulls you from the darkness is trying to save you. Some are just dragging you to a different slaughterhouse. As Briar turned and glided away, a wave of familiar, helpless despair washed over Nisa. But then, something else followed it. Something hot and dark and furious. A growl rose in her throat, so real she clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle it. Her vision seemed to sharpen, the edges of the leaves on the trees becoming painfully clear. The scent of jasmine was suddenly overpowering, but beneath it, she could smell the faint, cloying scent of Briar's deceit. Her wolf pressed forward. It was a feeling she had never known, a surge of savage energy that vibrated in her bones. She stood alone in the moonlit garden, shaking not with fear, but with a terrifying, exhilarating rage. She wasn't just a cellar rat anymore. Something else was waking up inside her. Something with teeth.
The rage he felt after Cale's report was a cold, killing thing. It demanded action. It demanded he go to Nissa's chambers, lock the door, and post a legion of his most loyal guards outside until he had strangled every last traitor in his keep. That was what the king in him, the scarred and paranoid alpha, wanted to do. But then, he remembered the look in her eyes. I will not be kept in a cage. Despite that, he didn't go to her chambers to give an order. Instead, as if pulled by a string, he found himself searching for her. He needed to see her. He needed to understand the woman his wolf had chosen, the woman someone was willing to kill to get rid of. He found her in the royal library. The vast, circular room was his only true sanctuary, filled with the quiet companionship of 1,000 sleeping stories. And there she was, a splash of borrowed blue silk in the dusty gold of the afternoon light, curled in a massive leather armchair by the window. She wasn't reading fairy tales or poetry. No. The book open in her lap was a heavy tome on ancient pack law and battle strategy. Something inside him shifted. He approached silently and she didn't notice him until he was standing over her. She started, her silver eyes flying up to meet his, a cornered fawn look that was quickly replaced by a wary defensiveness. "My king," she said, her voice quiet. "I see you found my preferred hiding place," he said, the words coming out softer than he intended. "I'm sorry, I can leave." "No," he said, a little too quickly. "Stay." He gestured to the book. Heavy reading for a newcomer. A faint blush touched her cheeks. "I thought it would be wise to understand the rules of the world I've been thrown into." Truth be told, her directness was a refreshing change from the simpering flattery he was used to. They fell into a strange, quiet truce. He asked her about the book, and she asked him a question about a famous battle. Her mind was sharp, her questions insightful. She wasn't just a survivor. She was an observer, a strategist who had learned her skills in the cruelest of classrooms. In that moment he saw her. Truly saw her. Not as a political problem, not as a symbol of his bond, but as Nisa. A flame of intelligence and will that had refused to be extinguished. The bond between them pulsed, a low, warm hum in his chest. He wanted to tell her everything, because for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something other than duty or bitterness. He wanted to tell her about Camilla, about the betrayal that had carved him into this hollow king. He needed her to understand that his harshness, his need for control, it was born from a terrible fear of history repeating itself. "Nisa," he began, the name feeling both foreign and perfectly right on his tongue. "There is something you should know about me, about my past." Before the words left his lips, the library doors opened. It was Ronan, his beta, his oldest friend. "Alpha," Ronan said, bowing his head. "Forgive the interruption. The guards are assembled in the training yard as you commanded." "Thank you, Ronan," Aldrich said, his voice tight with frustration. The moment was gone. But as Ronan met his gaze, Aldrich saw something flicker in his friend's eyes. Nerves. Evasion. Something was wrong. He dismissed it as his own paranoia. A fatal mistake.
The quiet connection she had felt with Aldrich in the library felt like a dream. The training yard was a harsh, noisy reality. Aldrich had insisted she come, standing on a balcony overlooking the yard. "You need to see," he'd said, his face grim. "You need to understand the men who guard you. You need to understand the violence they are capable of." So she stood there, watching dozens of wolves in their human forms spar below. The clang of steel on steel, the grunts of effort, the scent of sweat and steel filled the air. It was brutal and beautiful, a dance of deadly strength. Aldrich stood beside her, a silent, imposing presence. She was intensely aware of him, of the heat radiating from his body, of the way his scent seemed to wrap around her. Ronan, the king's beta, was directing the training. He glanced up at her several times, and his expression was odd, unreadable. It made her skin crawl. "They are using blunted blades for this exercise," Aldrich explained, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "For safety." But then, it happened. Ronan shouted a command, and 2 guards broke away from the main group, moving toward a set of training dummies near the base of her balcony. At a subtle nod from Ronan, they suddenly changed direction. They moved toward her. Fast. Their eyes were wrong. Not the focused gaze of a sparring partner, but the flat, dead look of a killer. And their blades. They weren't dull. In a flash of sunlight, she saw the wicked, sharpened edge. Her breath caught. Time seemed to slow, stretching into an eternity. Steel flashed, too close. A shout. Aldrich's. Pain. Her body moved on instinct. Without thinking, the strange, hot energy she'd felt in the garden surged through her veins. She didn't freeze. She didn't scream. She threw herself sideways, a desperate, impossibly fast dive. A searing pain ripped through her arm as one of the blades sliced through the silk of her sleeve, cutting a bloody line into her skin. She hit the stone floor hard, the impact jarring her teeth. What followed was a storm of violence. A black blur, Aldrich, launched himself from the balcony, landing with a ground-shaking thud. There were no swords in his hands. He didn't need them. The sound was not of steel, but of snapping bone and wet, tearing flesh. It was over in seconds. The two assassins lay broken and unmoving on the stones. Her world tilted. The smell of blood, coppery and thick, filled the air. Aldrich rose, his chest heaving, his face a mask of pure, unrestrained fury. But his rage wasn't directed at the bodies on the ground. Without warning, his golden eyes blazing with the light of his wolf, he lunged toward his beta. He seized Ronan by the throat, lifting the bigger man clear off his feet and slamming him against the courtyard wall. The stone cracked. "You!" Aldrich roared, the sound inhuman, a sound of pure alpha rage that shook the very foundations of the keep. Nisa could only stare, her bleeding arm forgotten at the stain of betrayal spreading across the stones.
The world was red, a haze of pure, murderous rage. He saw nothing but the face of his friend, his brother, contorted in terror. Ronan, the man who had stood by him for years, the man who had just tried to have his mate murdered right before his eyes. He dragged the gasping, choking beta down from the wall and toward the dungeons, the other guards scattering before his fury. The iron door slammed shut behind them, the sound a final, booming note of betrayal. He threw Ronan into the center of the cold, damp cell. "Why?" he snarled, advancing on him. I had to," Ronan choked out, scrambling backwards. "She is a weakness, Aldrich, a stray. She will undo us all." "She is my mate," Aldrich roared, and the force of his alpha command slammed into Ronan, who collapsed, whimpering. This was not an interrogation between men. This was an alpha tearing the truth from a traitorous pack member. He let the rage take him, because the pain of his own failure, the guilt of having put her in that position, the sheer terror of almost losing her, was too much to bear in any other way. He used the power of his voice, the dominance in his blood, to peel back the layers of the lie. "Who gave the order?" he growled, grabbing Ronan by the front of his tunic. Ronan sobbed, his will broken. It was her sister, the eldest one, Briar. Briar. The viper from Nissa's past. Of course, she had offered Ronan power, position, anything he wanted, if he would just remove the obstacle. It was a simple, petty plot born of jealousy. But Aldrich knew it wasn't that simple. Briar didn't have the resources to arrange this on her own. There was someone else behind her. Someone with more power. Lady Morwen. His mind raced, connecting the dots. The poisoner Cale had discovered. This clumsy assassination attempt. It was all part of a larger plan. And he had walked right into it. He had been so focused on the politics of the court that he had missed the serpent coiled in his own home. His rage cooled, replaced by something far more dangerous. Ice. A cold, absolute certainty. His last mate had betrayed him through conspiracy. And now, it was happening again. The same pattern, the same pain. His trauma screamed at him. You failed. You were weak. You trusted, and they tried to take everything. You failed to protect her. The logic that followed was brutal and absolute. He could not fail again. He would not. Protection wasn't about trust or partnership. It was about control. It was about eliminating every possible risk. He had tried giving her a sliver of freedom, and it had nearly gotten her killed. Never again. He left Ronan a broken, weeping mess in the dungeon and stormed back toward the royal chambers. His heart was a block of ice in his chest. His course was set. He burst into the room to find Nisa pacing, a maid trying futilely to bandage her bleeding arm. She looked up at him, her silver eyes wide with fear and 100 questions. He ignored them all. He strode past her, his face a mask of cold, unyielding resolve. "Aldrich, what happened? Who?" she began, her voice trembling. "From now on," he said, cutting her off, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "You will not leave these chambers. Guards will be posted at every door. No one enters, and you do not leave. For any reason. Ever." Her face fell, the hope draining from it to be replaced by disbelief, and then a flash of hurt so profound it was like a physical blow. "What?" No, you can't. I can, he said, turning to face her, his golden eyes cold as a winter sky. And I will. He looked at her, the woman his soul had chosen, and saw only a vulnerability he could not afford, a risk he had to contain. I will not lose you. The words were not a promise of love. They were the cold, hard vow of a jailer.
The silence he left behind was a living thing, humming with the ghost of his rage and the echo of his final chilling words. I will not lose you. Guards, silent as statues of stone, now stood outside her doors. Nisa paced the length of the chamber, the borrowed silk of her gown feeling like a shroud. A cage was a cage. Gold bars were no different from iron ones. The helpless terror she had lived with her whole life threatened to rise up and swallow her whole. But then, something else rose with it. The memory of the courtyard, the flash of steel, the impossible, instinctive way her body had moved, the strange, savage heat that had flooded her veins. That power was still there, a simmering coal deep inside her, and she would not let him smother it. When Aldrich returned hours later, his face was a mask of cold exhaustion. She was waiting for him, not cowering by the window, but standing in the center of the room, her spine straight. This is not protection, she said, her voice low and shaking, not with fear, but with a fury she was just beginning to understand. This is control, and I have been controlled my entire life. I will not trade one master for another. You do not understand, he began, his voice rough. I understand that your fear is making you a tyrant, she shot back, taking a step toward him. Is this what happened with your first mate? Did you try to lock her away too? Did you smother her until she hated you for it? She didn't know where the words came from, only that they were true. His face went pale, his eyes widening in shock. She had struck a nerve, a deep and painful one. You know nothing, he growled. I know that your ghosts are building my prison, she cried, her voice cracking with the sheer force of her emotion. A cage will not protect me. It will only make me weaker. Is that what you want? A weak mate? Someone you can hide away while the world burns? She took another step, her fists clenched at her sides. They tried to kill me today, and they will try again. So you have a choice. You can keep me in here, a helpless bird waiting for the snake to find a crack in the cage. Or you can teach me how to fight. She had to make him understand, because if their bond meant anything, it had to be a partnership, not a prison sentence. The air between them burned. He stared at her, his golden eyes a storm of emotions, rage, shock, and something that looked terrifyingly like pain. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, between one breath and the next, he moved. He closed the distance between them in a single predatory stride. His hands came up, framing her face, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man so full of rage. He looked down at her, his gaze so intense it felt like it was stripping her soul bare. You have no idea what you are asking for, he whispered, his voice raw. Then show me, she whispered back, her heart hammering against her ribs. And then his mouth was on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. A desperate, angry, passionate crash of two souls caught in a storm. It was all of his fear and control meeting all of her fire and defiance. It tasted of desperation and a longing so deep it ached. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her tight against his hard body, and she didn't fight it. She clung to him, meeting his fierce passion with her own. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathless, trembling. Her demand hung in the air between them, an ultimatum. He stared down at her, the ice in his eyes finally beginning to crack.
The ghost of his first mate had always whispered that love was a weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited. But Nisa had just stood before him, bruised and bleeding, and roared that being weak was the real danger. He left her chambers, the taste of her on his lips, the fire of her words searing through the cold fog of his trauma. Her challenge, teach me how to fight, wasn't just a plea for freedom. It was a demand for trust, a trust he hadn't given anyone in years. His mind was a battlefield, his old fears, his ingrained caution, his wolf's primal need to lock her away and protect her. It was all at war with the truth he saw in her silver eyes. She was right. A cage wouldn't save her. It would only make her the perfect target. With a new, terrifying clarity, he strode not to the dungeons, but to the rookery where his spy master, Kale, kept his shadows. When Kale appeared from the darkness, Aldrich's order was simple. Ronan only gave me the dog. I want the master of the hunt, he growled. Briar is a pawn. Who is moving the pieces? Follow the promises. Follow the whispers of power. As if fate demanded it, the pieces began to fall into place with sickening speed. Kale's network of spies was brutally efficient. They squeezed Ronan's known associates, followed the trail of the stepsister's unusual spending, and intercepted a coded message meant for a merchant caravan leaving at dawn. Hours later, Kale returned. He laid a piece of parchment on Aldrich's war table. It was sealed with the sigil of a snarling wolf's head Aldrich knew all too well. Alpha Grohl, a brutal, ambitious rival from the Shadowfen territories. The message was from Lady Morwen to Alpha Grohl, Kale whispered, his voice devoid of emotion. It confirms their bargain. Aldrich read the decrypted text, and a cold, murderous rage settled deep in his bones. It was all there. The bargain was explicit. Nissa's death, staged to look like an accident or an internal pack matter. In the ensuing chaos, Grohl's forces would strike, hitting a pack divided by a grieving and supposedly unstable Alpha. In exchange for her help from the inside, Morwen's daughters would be married into Grohl's high command, securing her a place of power in the new regime. He finally understood the full, horrifying scope of the plan because it was never just about a jealous sister. It was about tearing down his entire kingdom from the inside out. His mistake had been looking for a single serpent. This was a nest. Just as the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place, the doors to the war room slammed open. A border scout, his armor rent and his face pale with blood loss and terror, stumbled in and collapsed. "My king," he gasped, clutching a wound in his side. "They're here. Grohl's forces. They weren't at the border. It was a feint." "Where are they?" Aldrich demanded, his blood running cold. The scout looked up, his eyes wide with horror. "They're already past the outer walls. They came with the rising of the blood moon." He coughed, blood spattering his lips. "They're coming. Now."
The tension in the chamber was a living thing. Nissa paced, her body still humming from the force of her confrontation and the kiss with Aldrich. She didn't know if he would listen. She didn't know what would happen next. She only knew that she could never go back to being the girl in the cellar. Then she heard it, a single mournful blast from the Citadel's great alarm horn, a sound that had not been heard in a generation, a sound that meant only one thing: invasion. The horn was answered by a chorus of shouts from the courtyard, the clang of steel, and then a sound that chilled her to the bone. The savage, hungry howling of strange wolves. Many of them. Her heart leaped into her throat. The guards outside her door were gone, their heavy footfalls now running toward the sounds of battle. The chamber doors burst open. It was Aldrich. But he was not the conflicted king who had left her hours ago. This was the Alpha at war. His eyes glowed with golden light, and his face was a mask of grim, terrible purpose, and in his hands he carried 2 swords. He strode toward her, his movements fluid and deadly. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He held out the smaller of the 2 blades. The hilt was plain leather, the steel clean and sharp, the weapon perfectly balanced. It was an answer. It was a promise. It was trust, forged in the heat of battle. She took the sword without hesitation because in his eyes she saw not a command, but a plea. A plea for her to be as strong as he now believed she was. Her fingers closed around the hilt, and it felt right, as if she was born to hold it. "Stay by my side," he commanded, his voice a low growl that resonated with the wolf now stirring eagerly inside her. "Always," she answered, the word a vow. They raced from the chambers together, side by side, equals. They ran down the corridor and burst out onto a balcony overlooking the great hall. The sight below was chaos. The main gates were splintered, hanging from their hinges, and pouring through the breach was a tide of massive, snarling wolves, their fur matted and their eyes glowing with red malice. Grohl's forces. They were already inside. The war had come to them.
The time for strategy was over. This was not a battle of tactics. It was a desperate, brutal brawl for survival. He didn't hesitate. He shifted. The change was a maelstrom of agony and power. Bones snapping and reforming, skin splitting to reveal the thick black fur of his wolf. He grew, his form swelling into something monstrous, a beast of pure alpha power. When it was done, he threw back his head and loosed a roar that was not a sound, but a shock wave. It was a challenge, a command, a promise of death to all who had invaded his home. Below, his own guards, outnumbered, but not outmatched, rallied to the sound, their own shifts beginning. He leaped from the balcony, a black-furred comet of destruction, and landed amidst a pack of Grohl's mangy wolves. He was a whirlwind of claws and fangs. He tore through them, a force of nature, his every instinct screaming to clear a path, to hold the line, to protect the she-wolf who now stood on the balcony above, his anchor in the storm. For every enemy he ripped down, two more seemed to take its place. They were relentless, their eyes burning with a fanaticism he didn't understand. They weren't just soldiers, they were zealots. Then, through the chaos, he saw it, a hulking brute, larger than the others, with a scarred face and one milky white eye, broke through the line of his guards. It wasn't charging him. It was scaling the wall, its claws finding purchase in the ancient stone, climbing with unnatural speed toward the balcony, toward Nissa. A cold dread, colder than any he had ever known, seized him. He tried to disengage, to get to her, but he was swarmed, bogged down by the sheer weight of numbers. He took a deep, gouging wound to his side, the pain, a distant, unimportant thing compared to the terror of watching that beast climb. He could see the courtyard becoming a slaughterhouse. His loyal wolves, his friends, were being overwhelmed. They were fighting with the heart of lions, but the enemy was a flood, and they were drowning. He was failing. He, the great Alpha King, was failing to protect his home, his pack, his mate. The ghost of his past rose up to mock him, its voice whispering in his ear. "See, you are weak. You let them in. You will lose everything, just like before." He finally tore himself free from the scrum of bodies, his side a sheet of fire, and looked up. He was too late. The scarred wolf had reached the balcony. He saw Nissa, armed with the sword he had given her, but her face was a mask of pure, primal terror. She was a survivor, yes, a fighter. But she was not a warrior trained for this kind of savagery. He watched, helpless as the beast lunged, and in that moment, his world ended. His bond, the golden chain that connected their souls, didn't just fray. It screamed. A high, keening sound of pure agony that ripped through his very being, a pain far worse than any physical wound. He felt her terror, her despair, her final breaking point. His greatest fear, the one that had haunted his every waking moment since the first time he'd laid eyes on her, had come true. He had brought this upon her, his bond, his crown, his war. It had all led to this. His love had killed her.
The beast that scrambled onto the balcony was a nightmare given form. It was huge, its muscles cording under matted fur, its one good eye burning with a hateful red light. It smelled of stale blood and wet earth. Her sword felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hands. Aldrich was below, a force of nature, but he was trapped, surrounded. He couldn't help her. No one could. The wolf advanced on her, a low, rumbling growl shaking its massive chest. Its scarred muzzle wrinkled, revealing yellowed fangs dripping with saliva. This was it. The end. Her stepmother's words echoed in her memory, a final, cruel taunt from beyond the grave she was about to occupy. A rat is best left in the shadows. Her old self, the girl from the cellar, screamed at her to cower, to close her eyes, to accept her fate, to die, as she was always meant to. But then, through the roaring in her ears, she saw Aldrich. He was wounded, fighting with a desperate fury, his golden eyes fixed on her. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with a belief she had never, ever seen from anyone. He had given her a sword. He had trusted her, and she was about to fail him. The beast lunged. Her fear, her rage, her lifetime of pain, and the new fragile bud of love she felt for the broken king below all converged. The world went white hot. The sword dropped from her nerveless fingers, clattering on the stone. Because she didn't need it. A scream tore from her throat, but it wasn't a scream of terror. It was a scream of agony, of transformation, pain, unimaginable. Her bones snapped, breaking and reforming with sickening, wet cracks. Her skin stretched and tore. The world dissolved into a blur of pure, blinding sensation. It was the most excruciating moment of her life, and the most liberating. The last thing she felt as a girl was the cool stone of the balcony beneath her. The first thing she felt as a wolf was the unyielding certainty of her own power. She rose, not on 2 legs, but on 4. Her body felt strange and yet perfectly, absolutely right. She was larger than she'd expected, her fur the color of moonlight on snow, thick and pristine. She lifted her head and saw the world through new eyes, eyes that could see the heat rising from living bodies, that could see the subtle shifts of muscle and intent. The scarred beast stood frozen, its lunge halted, its one good eye wide with shock. She looked at him, at this creature that had come to kill the helpless girl she used to be, and a growl, a deep, rumbling promise of violence that came from the very core of her new being, ripped from her throat.
From the depths of his despair he heard it, a sound he had never heard before, a roar that was not his own, a sound of pure, untamed, feminine fury that cut through the clamor of the battle like a razor. He looked up, his heart stopping in his chest. The scarred beast was still there, but it was cowering, and standing over the sword Nisa had dropped was another wolf, a wolf he had never seen before. It was not as large as him, but it was sleek, powerful, its fur a startling, luminous silver white. Its eyes, when they caught the torchlight, were the same intelligent, fierce silver as the girl he thought he had just lost. Nisa. It was impossible. The first shift was a thing of legend, a rare and dangerous event that almost never happened outside of a controlled, guided ritual. For it to happen in the heat of battle, fueled by sheer terror and will, it was a miracle, or a curse. His despair was replaced by a new, sharper terror. She was a newborn, untrained, facing a seasoned killer. Her wolf may have answered the call, but she had no idea how to use it. She would be torn apart. This wasn't a reprieve. It was just a different kind of execution. He watched, frozen in horror, as the scarred wolf seemed to recover from its shock. It snarled, accepting the challenge. It lowered its head and charged. And Aldrich, the mighty Alpha King, could do nothing but watch. His bond, which had screamed with her agony moments before, now pulsed with a terrifying, wild power he didn't recognize. It was his lowest point. He was wounded, surrounded, and the one soul in the universe he was sworn to protect was about to die a second time, all because of him. He was powerless, and all seemed lost.
The scarred wolf charged, a mountain of muscle and mangy fur, its jaws wide to snap her in two. The human part of her, a tiny, screaming voice in the back of her new mind, was paralyzed with terror. But the wolf was not afraid. Her body moved on instinct. As the beast lunged, she didn't meet it head-on. That would be foolish. Instead, she dropped low, a blur of white fur, and let its momentum carry it over her. The instant its feet were off the ground, she pivoted, her powerful hind legs digging into the stone for purchase. She rose up and slammed into its exposed flank, her fangs sinking deep into the soft flesh of its belly. The beast howled, a sound of shock and agony, and tried to twist to get at her. But she was already gone, disengaging, dancing back. She knew exactly where to strike, because she had spent a lifetime watching bigger, stronger bullies, learning their patterns, their moments of overconfidence. Her whole miserable life had been an apprenticeship for this single moment. He came at her again, slower this time, more cautious. He feinted left. She didn't fall for it. He lunged right. She was already moving, a silver streak under his guard. This time, her jaws clamped down on the back of his leg, and she bit down with a sickening final crunch. Bone snapped. The giant wolf collapsed, its leg folding beneath it. It tried to drag itself up, snarling and snapping, but it was over. She stood over him, not with the frenzied rage of a cornered animal, but with a cold, clear purpose. He had come to kill the weak, frightened girl. But that girl was gone, and the wolf that had taken her place would not tolerate threats. She looked into his one good eye, and she let him see the predator she now was. Then, she ended it. In the sudden, shocking silence, she threw back her head. A sound she had never made before ripped from her throat. A howl. Not a cry of pain or fear, but a clear, ringing cry of victory. A declaration. It cut through the chaos of the battle below, a sound that announced a new power had just been born in blood and fire.
He watched her fight, and the world stopped making sense. His despair, the cold certainty of her death, evaporated like mist in the face of a rising sun. She was magnificent. She wasn't fighting like one of his warriors, all brute strength and roaring fury. No, she was fighting like a blade of grass in a storm, bending, weaving, yielding, and then striking with impossible speed and precision. She was smarter than her opponent, faster. She was using his own strength against him. When her howl, clear and triumphant, echoed through the great hall, it struck him like a physical blow. That wasn't the cry of a victim. It was the sound of a queen. He finally understood. He had been trying to shield a flame from the wind, not realizing she was the storm. His fear, his trauma, the ghost of Camilla. It had all blinded him to the truth that his wolf had known from the very first moment. Nisa was not a weakness to be protected. She was a power to be unleashed. A fire he had never felt before surged through his veins, burning away the last of his despair. It was pride. It was awe. It was a love so fierce it felt like it could remake the world. He fought with a strength he hadn't felt in years because he was no longer fighting out of fear of loss, but with the hope of a future he had never dared to imagine. The wolves that had swarmed him moments ago were now nothing but obstacles. He tore through them, no longer just defending but attacking, carving a path. He threw back his head and answered her howl with his own, but his was not just a cry of victory, it was a command, a rally. To me, his voice roared across the battlefield, a command that every one of his pack members felt in their bones. To your queen. A new energy surged through his warriors. They saw what he saw, they heard what he heard, and they turned the tide. He broke through the last of the enemy wolves separating them, his eyes fixed on the silver she-wolf who now stood poised on the balcony's edge, her gaze seeking his. His single-minded goal was no longer to save her. It was to join her, to stand by her side, because whatever came next, they would face it together.
She heard his howl, and her soul answered. It was a sound of command, of pride, of a king calling to his queen, and she knew, with every fiber of her new being, that was who she was. Without hesitation, she launched herself from the balcony. She landed on the blood-slick stones of the great hall below, a graceful, silent impact that sent a ripple of shock through the enemy ranks. The wolves closest to her backed away, their ears flat, their tails tucked, a low whine of fear in their throats. Then, he was there. Aldrich. He reached her side, his massive black form a stark and beautiful contrast to her own silver. He didn't try to shield her. He didn't nudge her back. He simply fell into place beside her, their shoulders brushing until they stood back to back, a fortress of claw and fang. The bond between them flared, no longer just a pull or a hum, but a roaring inferno of shared power, shared purpose. And they went to work. They moved as one. He was a hammer, a force of pure, overwhelming power that shattered enemy lines and broke bodies. She was a rapier, a flash of silver lightning that darted through the gaps he created, her attacks precise, deadly and brutally efficient. An enemy that turned to face him would find her fangs at its throat. One that lunged for her would meet the crushing force of his jaws. The lesser wolves fell back, not out of discipline, but out of sheer terror because they were witnessing something impossible. Two alphas, a king and a queen, fighting as one soul in two bodies. The chaos of the battle seemed to part before them, clearing a path. And at the end of that path, she saw him, a wolf bigger than any she could have imagined, larger even than Aldrich. His fur was the color of dried blood and dirty snow, his muscles like boulders under his scarred hide. He stood over the bodies of two of Aldrich's royal guards, his massive chest heaving. Alpha Groll. He ignored the dying battle around him. His eyes, small and intelligent and burning with pure malice, were locked on them. He saw the true threat. He saw the true power. As if the forest held its breath, Groll lowered his great head and let out a roar, a deep, guttural challenge that shook the very stones of the hall. It was a sound that promised a final bloody end. The final battle was about to begin. Alpha Groll's challenge was a promise of death, and he charged to collect. He was a runaway boulder, a force of pure, unstoppable mass, and he slammed into Aldrich with a sound like thunder cracking a mountain. The two giant alphas became a whirlwind of black and blood-red fur, a storm of snapping jaws and tearing claws. Aldrich was stronger, but Groll was heavier, fighting with a mad desperation. Nisa didn't hesitate. She was not a spectator in this fight. She was the deciding factor. She darted in, a silver flash of lightning to Aldrich's rolling thunder. She harried Groll's flanks, her sharp fangs ripping at his legs, forcing him to divide his attention. For every blow Aldrich landed, she created an opening. For every time Groll tried to pivot, she was there to hamstring him. But Groll was ancient and cunning. He knew he couldn't win a two-front war. In a move of brutal cleverness, he ignored a direct attack from Aldrich, taking a deep gouge to his shoulder just to pivot and lash out at Nissa. His massive paw caught her across the ribs, sending her tumbling through the air. She landed hard, pain exploding in her chest, the air knocked from her lungs. She saw Groll leave Aldrich, turning his full, murderous attention on her as she lay struggling for breath. This was his plan, to eliminate the wild card, to kill the queen in front of the king and break his spirit. She didn't run when Groll turned on her because she saw in his eyes the same arrogant cruelty as her stepmother, the same dismissive brutality as every noble who had ever sneered at her. She knew that this monster, right here, was the final ghost she had to destroy. As the giant wolf lunged, jaws wide for the killing bite, something inside her went perfectly, icily calm. Her body moved on instinct. Instead of scrambling away, she rolled toward him, under his lunge. It was a move of impossible, suicidal foolishness, and it worked. He soared over her, his jaws snapping on empty air. In the single moment he was airborne and off balance, she surged to her feet. At the same time, Aldrich, roaring with a fury that shook the rafters, slammed into Groll's side, preventing him from finding his footing. The moment their eyes locked, a silent command passed between them, a plan born of the bond. Groll scrambled, trying to rise, but it was too late. Aldrich pinned his shoulders to the stone floor, and Nisa, with every ounce of strength she possessed, leaped and sank her teeth deep into the base of the great wolf's throat. It was over. The great hall fell into a profound silence, broken only by the ragged panting of wolves. Groll's remaining forces, their alpha fallen, dropped to their bellies in universal submission. The war was won. Her bones ached, her ribs screamed, and a wave of exhaustion so profound it was dizzying washed over her. The wolf receded, and she collapsed back into her human form, bloody and naked amidst the carnage. Before she could fall, strong arms were around her. Aldrich already shifted back, wrapped his own cloak around her small, trembling body and held her close. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds, but he held her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. and in the safety of his embrace, she finally let the darkness take her.
The cold light of dawn was a merciless thing. It streamed through the shattered windows of the great hall, illuminating the cost of their victory. The dead were being carried away with honor, the wounded tended to with grim efficiency, and the traitors were being brought to justice. Aldrich sat on his throne, not the bone throne of the Alpha, but the great wooden throne of the king. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a peace he hadn't known in years. Nisa sat in the queen's throne beside him, her borrowed silks replaced with a simple, clean gown of gray wool. She was pale and bruised, her arm tightly bandaged, but her silver eyes were clear and steady. She was magnificent. The great doors opened and the prisoners were dragged in. Lady Morwen, her face a mask of cold, unrepentant fury. Briar, weeping and pathetic now that her cruelty had no power. Lyra, her youngest, just looking lost and terrified. And Ronan, his former beta, his head bowed so low in shame he couldn't meet Aldrich's gaze. Aldrich stood. A hush fell over the assembled court. They expected him to speak, to roar, to sentence them all to a bloody death. Instead, he looked at Nissa. "The betrayal was against you, my queen," he said, his voice ringing with a pride that made his chest ache. "The justice is yours to deliver." A collective gasp went through the hall. He was ceding the highest authority of the Alpha to her. It was a declaration. She was not just his mate. She was his equal. Nissa rose, her movements stiff but graceful. She looked down at the people who had made her life a living hell. She did not look triumphant. She looked sad. "Briar," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the hall. "You took pleasure in cruelty because you believed it made you strong. Now you will learn what it is to be truly alone." She looked at Aldrich. Strip her of her name and her pack. Let her be cast out as a rogue. It was a fate worse than death. She turned to Lyra. "You were never the monster. You just followed one. You will serve in the lower keep, and every day you will be reminded that the sister you mocked is your queen." Finally, her gaze settled on Lady Morwen. "You tried to burn down a kingdom to warm your own hands," Nissa said. "You will be escorted to the border of the lawless lands. The rogues in the wilderness can have you." He knew her judgment was perfect, because it wasn't just punishment. It was a lesson to the entire court about the nature of true power and consequence. After the prisoners were dragged away, a servant brought forth the queen's crown on a velvet cushion. It was an ancient, beautiful thing of silver and moonstones. Aldrich took it in his hands. He turned to Nissa, his heart so full he thought it might burst. The entire court was watching, waiting for him to complete the ceremony, waiting for him to crown his queen.
Aldrich stood before her, the silver crown glittering in his hands. This was the moment, the final seal on her impossible new life. She had survived. She had fought. She had won. He took a step closer, his golden eyes holding hers, and in their depths, she saw a love so profound, so absolute, it took her breath away. He was about to place the crown on her head, to make her his queen in the eyes of the world. But then, as if the world narrowed to a single point, he did something that shattered 1,000 years of tradition. He knelt. He knelt before her, the Alpha King, the conqueror, the most powerful wolf in the known world. He knelt before the girl from the cellar. He held the crown up to her, not as a gift he was bestowing, but as an offering. It was not his to give. It was hers to take. Tears filled her eyes, blurring his image, because in that single revolutionary act, he wasn't just making her a queen. He was healing every scar, every whisper that had ever told her she was worthless. He was telling her and the entire world that she was his equal. Her hand, steady and sure, reached out. She took the crown from him. It was heavier than she'd expected. The weight of a kingdom, the weight of a future. And she placed it on her own head. She stood there for a moment, the queen of her own making. Then she reached down and took his hand, pulling him to his feet. He rose to stand beside her, not as her king, but as her partner, her mate. In the quiet that followed, she knew the final truth. The bond had never been a cage. It had been the key. It hadn't given her strength she didn't possess. It had simply unlocked the door to the power that had been inside her all along. It wasn't a prison. It was a liberation. As the sun crested the mountains, streaming through the broken windows and bathing them in golden light, they stood together hand in hand, and in the silent, perfect peace of their souls, their two wolves, a storm of black and a whisper of silver, threw back their heads and howled as one. A promise. A vow. A new dawn.